Welcome to the channel, and if you've been around here, you know that I do a lot of stuff with pianos. Now, I didn't want to do another piano restoration video quite yet because it feels like I have a lot of piano stuff, but they're all just so different. The Yamaha was a wood finish, and I feel like on this piano I did a lot more and I went more in depth with some of the repairs and some of the inside stuff that you do. So, stick around and check out this video. I hope you guys enjoy it. And as always, feel free to throw any questions in the comments section. Oh, don't let that... Alright YouTube viewers, what's up? Now if you're new to this channel, you're going to find out pretty quick that I do a lot of piano work. I restore acoustic pianos, I repair and maintain electric pianos for the places that I work, and the list just goes on. I move them, I tune them, I do a little bit of everything. So I have so much content and so many video and picture files that I need to put them to good use. And of course, every restoration is a little bit different. Like on the Yamaha that you could see from before, that was a wood finish. Now on this piano, we're going to do a satin black. The customer had already agreed to purchase this piano, but they wanted something that wasn't super shiny. So they said satin black's going to be perfect. And, you know, from a painter standpoint, it's a little easier to get a satin finish to look great because you can have some little tiny flaws and imperfections and practically never care about them with satin, but when you have clear coat, they show up like, I mean, they stand out like a sore thumb. So this one's going satin black. This piano had quite a few repairs. There was a lot of little areas where the wood was coming loose, and it's mostly all cosmetic. As far as playability, it was a great piano, and I actually owned it and kept it in my house for over a year before I decided to sell it. So I loved this piano. And once I was restoring it, I just had to make sure I fixed all those little wood veneer sections. There were a couple places that I even had to completely rebuild a corner or something because maybe it had gotten chipped, you know, years ago. So we're going to get on into this. We're going to start with the main case, and that's the way I typically do a grand piano, because once the case is done, then I can do the legs. And once it's standing on its own legs, it's really easy for me to just paint parts one at a time, get them, you know, restored and put on, and I'll assemble the piano fully before I get it ready to move to the customer's home. So here we go. Let's do it. So with this little Adam Shaft piano, it was in awesome playable condition. It holds tune pretty well. I've heard really good things about these pianos, and I'll tell you, it's the best sounding 5-foot baby grand from probably the early 1900s I've ever heard. When it comes to these really old antique pianos, they're very hit or miss with how the bass section sounds. And down here, if I had a way to, you know, hold the mutes up and let you hear some of those bottom notes, there's really good tone all the way down to the low A. So this piano is great. It's just got more cosmetic issues than anything. It has some veneer areas that were improperly repaired before. It looks like somebody just kind of, you know, sloppily tried to glue them back down. So speaking of wood repairs, you'll see a pretty large section here on the front, right where the fallboard rests. I basically had to remove that whole piece because right at the top you could see where it was coming off. And I'll use various chemicals to loosen up the old glue. You just have to do it real controlled so you're not getting, you know, some of these solvents like everywhere and putting them in places where they shouldn't be going, where you don't want to loosen the glue. But once that piece is off, I was able to save it and then sand it really good, because you gotta, anytime that you're gonna re-glue a wooden piece back on, you gotta make sure you sand all that old glue off, because the new wood glue is not gonna stick to the old wood glue. So a lot of these pieces were able, well, at least a few of the ones that I did were able to be reused because they were still in great shape. They just needed to be reattached. So I just carefully prepped it out really good, got the glue put on as evenly as I could, and you'll find that masking tape sometimes works as a really good clamp for things. If it's not very heavy and you don't need a whole bunch of force, you can use tape, and it seems to hold things on pretty well, and you can use as much of it as you want. So if you need it clamped in every little inch, then that's kind of what I did here, and it seemed to work pretty well. Once I got this little front piece glued back on and the other small wood repairs, I guess I figured it was time I could mask, and make sure that you spend a lot of good detail time masking when it comes to having, you know, strings and actual piano parts still in the piano. If the whole thing were completely disassembled, the masking may not be as difficult, but you know, sometimes you gotta really get around things. You want to do a really nice job. So precise masking definitely helps out a lot. Also, the red putty that you'll see in areas fills in small scratches and small divots. It's great stuff. You don't have to mix it with a hardener. I use typically a little razor blade and just kind of push it into the cracks and things like that. And once it dries, you sand it really easily, and it kind of helps get us ready for primer a lot quicker. So the satin black that we're using on this is definitely that one that I use on other projects you may have seen in some other videos. It's made by DuPont Imron. Now I believe it's Axalta. I think that company bought it out or whatever. But it's basically their 3.5 plus polyurethane, and it is an industrial coating, so it's really strong. And it works great on pianos because, you know, the old polyester finishes were really strong, and I mean, I feel like this stuff definitely, for being like a nice kind of automotive industrial style paint, it can take some aging at least. I mean, you don't want to say it takes a beating. I mean, no paint really takes a beating. You're pretty much always gonna dent it or whatever, but it's pretty resistant to scratches and things like that. Now I'll generally lay this coating on pretty wet, just so where it's nice and even. That way when you get the shine, you know that you've laid it on evenly, and then as it dries, it'll turn more of a satin. The gloss kind of goes away and it gets a really nice satin sheen that we love. So once the main case was painted, I felt like this would probably be a pretty good time to give it a good cleaning. You know, clean up all the keys and the soundboard and things like that. And I want to say, on this piano, I did one of the legs kind of early, and that's why you see a leg bolted on this one. Of course, I can't remember, I don't think there was a reason I would have put it on unpainted. So I'm pretty sure I did one of the legs pretty quick, and then I might have did the other two with a few other parts, but we'll get there. Now you can imagine the legs for some pianos, they're pretty beat up, but I mean, it's the part that hits the floor, it holds up the piano, people brush up against them, maybe the vacuum cleaner hits it, you never know. But it seems like the legs on most of the grand pianos that I work with always need a lot of work. They either tend to be in perfect condition or terrible condition. So these legs needed quite a bit of the veneer removed and re-glued, just kind of like we did on the case a little bit. And once I got that done, the rest was pretty straightforward. At least this old black finish was fairly easy to sand down and prep for the new paint. But once the leg repairs are done, we just kind of went through the same process. Get primer where it was needed, get the spot putty done, and get them finished. I also spend a lot of time polishing brass. You'll see another section in this video where I take any brass on the piano that's kind of restorable. If I can sand little scratches out of it, you go through the grits and get all the way up to about 2,000 or 3,000 grit sandpaper, and then basically polish that brass back out to a shine. And it always looks great that way. So I'll get more in detail on that later, but you'll see the big brass ferrules that go on the bottom of these legs. Those get shined up as we go. Now when I had these legs ready, I also decided to do a few other parts. So I got the prop stick ready and the little side blocks that hold the music rack on. So it's kind of nice whenever you get a bunch of parts together and you can spray them all at once, and then you got a lot of things you can put back together. Makes it go a little quicker sometimes. Sometimes it's really cool to just be able to, do your own stuff like this. And I mean, like, anybody, if you put your mind to it, you can figure this stuff out. I mean, it's all, there's a lot of trial and error. Nobody really taught me this stuff, but I'll take these pictures because it's looking so cool sometimes, even though it's not finished. It's like I just can't resist doing these little mini photo shoots when I'm fixing something up. So that's all this is. I figured I'd throw some pictures together. As I mentioned briefly before, I do a lot of work to get the brass looking good on these pianos. Brass is really cool because it's one of those things where with some care and polishing, you can make it look like it has a super shiny gold plating on it. I mean, you can put a mirror shine on this stuff. And some pieces of brass will stay that way for a while. Other pieces I found will tarnish pretty quick. I think it just really depends on the grade of the brass and maybe the ending polish that I use. So maybe some of them I put some type of a wax on, and then maybe on another part I might leave that step off and it seems like they'll tarnish faster. I haven't really figured out the science to that, but I do use a brass lacquer on some of the parts now, and it's just basically a clear coat for brass, and it seems like that helps out a lot too. Brass lock plate that goes here is missing, so what we want to do is take a piece of brass, some sheet metal. I'll end up cutting out a piece and making a new lock striker for that. So I'm starting to lay out the missing lock striker that goes in there. So holes are there and stuff. I just gotta cut it out of a piece of brass and get it to fit nice. Now once I got this little missing brass piece rebuilt, I actually realized that at some point in this piano's life, something must have been tampered with or misaligned, because even when I tried to lock the lid, or I would turn the key, let the little latch come down, it seemed like it just wasn't going to line up right on this plate. Like it was going to be very, very close for me to actually get the plate to line up properly, or the latch might ended up like right at the edge. So realizing that this wasn't going to work without some extensive repair, and this was a pretty low budget, build, they weren't super concerned about those kind of things. Having the fall board able to lock was kind of a plus because I made a key for it. But this was just one of those things that we kind of had to let go, just given the circumstances. So once I figured that out, I just decided to leave this plate blank instead of cutting the slot in it. And that way it'll just be a nice little blank off and there won't be a big hole in the wood right there. Alright, here's a fun one. Making a key. Now some of these pianos had really simple latches where, like the key that operated it was maybe a triangle tip or a square tip or something of that matter. Even the ones that had like a circle with a hole in the middle or like a pin, they're not super difficult to make. And this happened to be one of those pianos where I could make a replacement key for the lock, and I did it. Now it worked for the fall board, and as I mentioned before with the brass work, the same key would have also locked the lid. Now in the Yamaha pianos, you just lock the lid and it locks everything all the way down, the fall board and stuff. But this piano was a little different. You had a separate lock for the fall board, and then the one at the lid was the one that we weren't going to get to work. But at least it was cool to make this little key. I just used some old steel and even left some of the rust pits in it, so it made the key look a little aged. So I thought that was kind of cool. And it worked just fine. One of the things I'll do with a mild restoration even is I'll replace the felts that are easy to get to and easy. So when it comes to like all the felts, some of them have the little ones inside the keys that keep the keys tight on the posts and things like that. I'm not going to go through and replace all that unless I know that it's a, kind of a high dollar build and we're really trying to restore the thing to, to feel like it's new. But a lot of these felts that really matter are usually worn out bad and halfway gone. So I'll replace the ones, like I said, the ones that are easy to get to, and they really make a big difference. It's kind of like you get a lot of bang for your buck in some of these. Like, it takes you maybe 5 minutes to replace it, but it makes all the difference in the way it looks. Especially the one under the fall board. You put that nice red right there and it rests up against the keys. That's a really nice touch, and it really makes the restoration look a lot more professional and helps the piano feel a lot newer. Sometimes these screw holes get really weak and we don't want that piece of wood to ever break out, so we're going to strengthen this up back here a little bit with some two-part filler. This is not just something you'd go and get from like your home improvement warehouse. This is like it's more of like a professional kind of, this is basically a super glue thing, but It works a lot different with this material. Nothing like pretty piano music being in your house. So this particular piano had a pretty good action. There were maybe 2 little let-off boots or kicker things that I had to replace because they were just missing. And one of them I actually had to make. I think one of them was laying in there. And the other one I had to make a copy of the one that was laying there. So I had to carve it, you know, it was a real small, tedious piece. But I got it back in there and got it to work. And as far as everything else, what you're going to see in this part of the video is I was replacing a post. There's the little, I want to say there were 4 posts that hold the keys down to the key bed. Now one of those posts was completely missing, and I believe all 3 of the other blocks, the little wooden block that holds that little post stud, I want to say all 3 of them, or at least 2 of them, were loose. Now there's 4 total, so I want to say there were 3 left over. One of them I ended up having to replace that as well. So we kind of went through this, and I put back the pieces that were missing. You know, I threaded the little studs myself and even built the little circular nuts that had to go on there. But it wasn't too bad. It's just one of those little things where I probably could have spent a lifetime trying to find those parts to order them, and just figured it wasn't too much for me to make them. I had the brass round stock, and I had the little rods to build the studs, and the correct threading tool too, so it worked out pretty good. Of course, like I said, if you can get a lot of bang for your buck with replacing the felts, I'll do it. And in this case, those little green bumpers that you see for going under the keys, those were easy enough. You just lift them off the little posts and put the new one on. The old ones were all tore up. They looked like, you know, they had been chewed up by mice or something. I'm sure they were just deteriorated, but they were these old white ones and they were half gone. So I figured, you know, these things are cheap enough, let's throw on some new ones, and it might make a little difference in the way the keys bump. So you'll see me doing that here too. So what's going on here, there's these these 4 little stud posts that hold a bar that goes across all the keys. There's one on the end, there's a second one that was missing, that's why I'm doing all this. There's a third one, and fourth one was over here. So these things over the years, well actually that one's pretty tight. I'll probably be able to leave that one alone. The first one is loose, and this one was loose, and this is just my centering guide pin, so that's just a piece I can take out. But what happens is you've got a threaded rod that goes into here. The thread's down in there, and you see it kind of sticks up. So then there's one long wooden slat that goes over the whole thing, and that's how you secure it down, is with those 4 studs. So this is the one that I took from here, and since the second one was missing, I had to cut a piece of rod. And I actually made this one, but it was a little bit too short. I want it to be just as long, and once I was able to get this out, I decided to cut another piece of rod and do it again. So I'm gonna thread this rod to be exactly like that copper colored one. We'll get rid of this other one, and I'll be able to install it in the second one that was missing. But while I'm in here, I noticed that the little blocks that hold the rods in, 2 of them are loose. So I cleaned up the bottom. I'm gonna go ahead and glue that back really good and clamp it overnight so it can dry. But yeah, so basically that had come loose over the years. It causes these little these pins to wobble. Now these are guide pins for the keys. That's something different. There's only 4 of these that hold the keys down to the key bed, and that's what we're doing. So we're threading a rod. I'm also probably gonna have to make the little circular parts that thread on there. I have some brass rod, and since I have my threading tools, I'll be able to drill a hole, thread the inside, so I'll be able to make the nut that actually goes on there as well. I just have the rods right now, so we'll keep it going. Now the fall board on this piano was pretty beat up. Not completely broken really in any way, but it had a lot of dings and nicks and, you know, little surface imperfections in it. So you'll see it's kind of the same process. I go through, I use a spot putty and get it all nice and smooth, and then we give it a good coat of primer to get it ready for paint. Now of course, like everything else with an old finish, you're going to start by sanding and trying to strip most of that old finish off. Now The thing with this finish that's good is I didn't have a problem with it chipping really. This finish was bonded to this piano wood about as good as you could ever ask for. So I really wasn't worried about putting new paint on and having it flake off with the old paint. I was just more concerned about the surface imperfections like I was talking about. So when you've got a really good strong old finish, you don't really have to strip it. There's not a lot of reason to go down to the wood unless you're going to do a wood finish. So in this case, I think I had some 80 grit. I just wanted to rip down that old finish so that we thin it out quite a bit. And also that helps you fill some of those surface nicks because that old finish is so thick that you can use some of it almost as a first coat of primer. So that's pretty cool. So took it down with probably about 80 grit sandpaper, and once I hit bare wood, I don't really want to sand that with 80, especially with any kind of machine sander. You'll tear the edges right down. It'll make it look horrible. You know, anything, especially on a musical instrument, you do a lot of hand sanding because that way you can really control what you're doing. It's only the really big flat areas of the main case that I'm usually going to use a DA sander or anything like that. And even by then, I'm probably using a finer grit like 220 or 320 when I'm doing that. Nothing crazy like 80 grit. I mean, you're literally reshaping wood if you're using 80 grit on the DA. So keep that in mind. I sanded it down, and since we're going to prime pretty thick, it's okay to prime over 80 grit scratches, but a lot of times, even with a good thick primer, I want to go back and smooth those out with some 120 or 180, maybe even 220 grit. That way it doesn't start to shrink in. If you know automotive paint materials and really any paint materials, over the first couple weeks of curing, they're going to shrink in. So if you started with 80 grit scratches and you sprayed primer in there, there's a good chance that that stuff is going to kind of shrink down and those scratches are going to show up. So it's better if they weren't there in the first place. It's better if you can smooth, you strip it with the 80 grit and then smooth that out with some 120 or 180, just so you're not priming over such a harsh, grit. Alright, so the first coat of spot putty's on. We're sanding and working out all these little nicks and bringing it back to life. We'll be ready for primer in no time. Now, depending on what you're doing, your prime and paint process is always going to vary. I've explained it a little bit in the video previously, but what I did on this piano was pretty much strip down the old finish, fill in my imperfections, do the repairs. I did, 3 pretty good coats of primer. Usually that'll do it, but sometimes you got to go back and do your primer again, especially on the main case where you're really trying to, work out certain things. Sometimes you just really, really want to get that curve nice and fluid. So it all just depends on what you're working with. But on this one, it was pretty straightforward. We get it prepped, we get it primed, and then we're going to sand that primer with 220 to 320 grit. And 320 is pretty much what you'd want to paint over. If I'm sanding with 220, it just means that I'm cutting it with that first to get a lot of the surface texture down. And then I'm going to finish sand it off with 320, maybe even some 400, just to make sure that when we paint over it, there's no light scratches that are going to show through. And then we get that paint on. It's pretty much a done deal. Let it dry and see how it comes out. Out of this whole piano, this music rack was probably in the worst condition out of all the parts. It had delamination, you know, pieces of the wood veneer coming apart. It had, someone had written, "I hate you," and with a, probably, I don't know, some kid with a paper clip or something at one point. Which I tried to prime that out. Unfortunately, sometimes you can't get all of it in one coat of primer, but that it ended up showing up a little bit later, unfortunately. So this music rack needed a lot of work, and we're gonna go through a little bit of that here and kind of show, you know, there was a part on the prop where someone had wire tied two parts of the wood together with some copper wire at some point. I don't know. Anyway, you gotta, with something like this, it pretty much means take it completely apart, take one piece at a time. You know, you're going to have the music support piece, you're going to have the actual desk that slides into the piano, you're going to have to take the hinges off of the back, and you know, usually these things will come apart into 4 or 5 pieces, and you really just, one piece at a time, you know, do the wood repairs, make sure everything's going to go back together really nicely, and that's pretty much the gist of it. It's tedious. The music rack is pretty tedious because it's got small parts that kind of move together, and if something's out of whack, it's not going to operate properly. You know, you've got the little flap that goes up and down, and you know, it's just, it can be a thing. There was a lot of work put into this to get it back to almost perfect condition, but it worked out. Alright, so before I take this thing apart, I wanted to take a little bit of video, the kind of things you could run into in restorations. Now, it's ain't just pianos, it's like custom classic cars and things like that too. And basically, you know, what happens is sometimes like things can look okay, and I mean, it's functional. You know, this sits in the piano this way. It's the music desk, and you can see it kind of flips up. But then you start to look around on it, you know, you get the piano taken apart and you start really looking close, and you find things like this where the wood is delaminated. Now, the way some of these parts are built, see if we can focus here, the way some of these parts are built is there's different pieces of wood glued together, because as you know, if you use one piece of wood to make something, especially like a precision musical instrument, a lot of times that one piece of wood over time is going to bow and warp and do funny things. So I think over time they figured out there's certain types of wood that are good for your structures, and then you'll use other types of wood for the outside that are good for finishing, and that's where you get these thin wood veneers. They're just glued together in sections to make up one big piece like this music rack. So what has to be done when you find things like this is you have to remove this whole panel. Now, I'll use certain chemicals to pour down in there to get the rest of the glue to loosen up, because I want to carefully remove this whole piece without breaking this little leg off, and remove it all the way down to the bottom so that I can clean the glue in there. So there's a reason why you can't just squirt some glue in this seam here and clamp it back together to let it dry, because the old glue probably deteriorated and turned into powder, and now you're going to have a really inconsistent surface. If you tried to glue, most likely it wouldn't hold very well depending on what kind of glue that you use. So I got to take the piece off completely, sand both sides, you know, the inside or whatever, this side and the other side, and then I'm gonna do a nice coat of wood glue and clamp this down really nice and tight, so that when I get ready to paint this part, all the seams are closed up good and we're not gonna have any potential cracking and separating issues again. So things always end up taking longer than you anticipated, because sometimes, you know, you can get a piano, you get all the parts, and you know, you just either you don't notice those kind of things, you might kind of overlook it and be like, well, I'll fix that later. That's what happens here. Now, this one is, over the years, it's held together, but also there are things that are done by other technicians or other people, maybe the owners, that are also kind of self-destructive. Like, instead of going to a hardware store and getting the proper screws, you know, that were starting to fall out of the holes on this hinge, they'll go and they'll put the wrong size screw in it. And you can see here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. When you look over here on the front, it was barely too long, so we've got it where it tried to poke through. There's 5, well, let's see, yeah, there I can find all of them right there. 2, 3, 4, and 5 places where the screw was too long. So not only do I need to get the right screws and put them in the back, I need to get also the ones that are missing, and then I'm gonna have to fix these areas before I can actually paint this panel. So every piece takes attention to detail or it's just not gonna look right. And when you're talking about, you know, a beautiful musical instrument like a piano, you wanna spend the time, especially a nice old grand piano. It's worth it to do this because the value of it is only gonna increase. So you can see another example. This one piece, this is why I'm filming this piece, because this one part to the piano has moving parts on it and things, but it has a lot of issues by itself that I have to fix. And you can see what people do. They do these like, you know, kind of half-hearted repairs. Like somebody, you know, tried to glue this, it was glued poorly, but then they wrapped some kind of metal wire around it to hold it together. I mean, what's that? I guess it worked, but also they inserted a screw here instead of the correct dowel pins. And what that does is it catches so that, you know, the music rack can set at whatever setting that you put it to. If you play piano, you're going to set it to where you want it as far as the tilt on it. And the screw is a terrible way to do this because it puts a little scratch all the way across it when people move it and they drag it over these. It also is cutting a little notch, as you can see, in that little setting. So I gotta fix that. It takes a really special type of resin to fix these things right because you need something on that little spot that's gonna hold good and strong. Then of course I'll put the correct pins in there so that from now on it's not gonna tear it up anymore. And besides all that, you can see the dents and nicks that are gonna have to kind of be sanded and fixed out before I can paint it. I replace all these little rubber stoppers because after a lot of years, they practically turn into hardened plastic. The rubber becomes so hard and deteriorated, it's like plastic. So it doesn't really do its job anymore. Same thing with these small hinges. There's screws missing, and the wood, I know I could see on the other side at least. I think someone did the little screw trick over here, so I gotta fix that part. So there's a lot of little repairs like this that you're just gonna, when you add it all together, the restoration ends up taking longer than you originally anticipated because you want it to be done right. You don't want all this stuff to just happen again, or, you know, this thing would be on the verge of falling apart. But all that's gonna be taken care of. We're gonna pay attention to it and address all these issues, as well as I'll probably get a bunch of new brass screws like the ones you see on the what it looks like the top, the way we're angled here, not the silver ones that are incorrect. I'll get the right brass screws to go in this thing, and once it's painted I'll get it all put back together, you know, fix the little piece back there that's broken. It's kind of one thing after another. So this this music rack, even though it still stands up and works like this, it's a perfect example of what you deal with when you restore things. And then even to add to it, the old felt here on the side, this is what keeps the paint from getting dinged up on the inside of the grand piano. There's a liner of felt that goes here. It also allows this to slide a little bit more smoothly along the guide rails. So we're gonna redo this with some really nice like red felt probably inside there and get this old green stuff off. And all that stuff takes time, but when we're done, this thing is gonna look marvelous. I mean, look at that. It's, you know, it's been through, I mean, it's 100 years old or so. So it's done its time. It needs to be redone. And just part of the process, but it's exciting to see what they look like when they're all finished and looking brand new. Hope you guys enjoyed this. It's a little bit of what you deal with when you restore things, and you know, sometimes you think you're getting into a 2-hour project, but then it turns into 5 hours, or a 2-week project turns into 10 weeks or something. So you just never know. It's everything is different. You know, down to the little kids, they like to write mean messages. So, all right, this piece right here, they're kind of notorious for this on some pianos because I don't know if the glue they're using just isn't good, or I mean, 100 years, that's pretty good anyway. But I'll notice even on some of the new Yamahas, that's kind of ridiculous. they'll be bubbling up right here, like the wood delaminates and comes loose from the main structure. So I was able to safely remove this piece and keep it intact, even though, you know, a little bit here kind of comes up. All this can get re-glued. And once you clean the old glue off, both sides, it stays intact and it glues back on nice and tight. It should stay for at least another 100 years because we use really good glue now. So that's one of those things you kind of run into. It ends up taking you a few hours to get the piece off. It's tedious to like get this off without breaking it, but it is possible. So the glue was loose over here and here. I ended up having to slowly work the glue off the rest of the areas with chemicals. But now we got it, we're ready to glue it and clamp it back together. And the music rack will be ready for me to... These other parts are pretty much ready to go. So it's going through the process of the refinish, getting it repainted. And that's that. So it looks like the piece of laminate's going back on pretty nice and snug. But that's just what it takes. Lots of clamps all the way around it. There we go. Yeah, so to say it again, that was a lot. That music rack required quite a bit of work to get it to that neutral position where now we can go through the regular prime and paint process and get it ready to put back together. So on to the lids. Now, these are definitely focal points. It's the first thing you pretty much see whether the piano's open or closed. You're gonna have the smaller lid at the back that opens up, and then you've got the larger section of the lid, and all that comes apart. I take the main hinge off, and I do the parts separately, and usually I have to come up with some clever way to use the hinge points to actually hang these parts so that I can spray the bottom and the top all together at one time and not have to do some crazy tape work. But this is pretty important. You definitely want your lids to look really nice and put in the extra work. You know, there's parts of the piano that are kind of hidden, but this is definitely something where if there's any big flaws or mistakes, you're gonna see it pretty quick. So run through that same process all over again and we'll be 1 or 2 or 3 steps closer to being done. Well, I think that's going to do it for another successful piano restoration DIY. I hope that you guys learned something, and I hope that you come back because I got a lot more that I can share with you. Thanks a lot for all the continued support, and we'll see you on the next one.